Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. So yeah, we are from Adfree Cities, which is a small campaign group based in Bristol in the UK. And we'll be talking about what cities can do about advertising overconsumption in the context of the climate crisis. Adfree Cities are a network of groups who are concerned about the impacts of commercial outdoor advertising on our communities, our well-being, our economies, our local economies, and the climate. And we celebrate alternatives to outdoor advertising such as arts, public art, nature, and wildlife and community. And in our network of grassroots groups that we have across the UK, our Adblock groups, we support policymakers and resident-led campaigns to stop new digital billboards where people live, and also to introduce healthier and low-carbon advertising policies. We work on national policy change across these objectives, and we also work closely with the UK advertising regulator, particularly around greenwash advertising, which is something I won't talk about much today. So at Adfree Cities, when we talk about the impact of advertising on consumerism and on our consumption-based emissions, we're talking not only about the message, about the advertising content we see for things which are really highly polluting, like cars, airline flights, fossil fuel companies, meat, and maybe even fast fashion, things that we know we need to reduce and phase out in order to meet our climate goals. But also we're talking about the medium, so digital billboards which use millions of tiny LED bulbs, which by themselves are very energy efficient, but actually combined to make something this large, actually use a massive amount of electricity at times when we know that electricity is scarce, and some cities are even predicting sort of blackouts and energy is very expensive. So there's a contradiction there that comes into this idea of reducing emissions as well. So we know that advertising works, and part of that reason is because it uses some of the best creative minds in the world to make adverts that basically convince us to consume, and in many cases convince us to consume things that, yeah, like I said, we know we need to reduce rather than increase. And while we sometimes don't necessarily think that advertising affects us or impacts us, we can think, oh, we can just look away. Actually, we know from neuroscientific research that through something called the low attention processing model, our implicit nervous system is subconsciously taking on these messages that we're surrounded by all the time on an increasing basis as advertising seeps into more and more areas of our lives, from public transport networks to billboards on our streets, as well as the millions of ads we see every day on our screens. And it's estimated now that an average person sees between 6,000 and 10,000 adverts per day. And as those adverts are convincing us to buy more material goods, to follow less sustainable lifestyles, to take a flight, have to think about what that impact is on our culture, on our behaviors, and on our efforts, and the efforts that cities are taking to try and reach net zero goals. And this quote from George Monbiot says a lot. Every year, advertisers press a little further into our lives, shrinking the uncontaminated space in which we may live. In ways in which we are often scarcely aware, they change our perceptions of the world, alter our values, and infiltrate the language. And thinking about all the ways in which we know we need to change, what does it say to be surrounded by advertising that changes our perception of the world? What perception is that? Is it of a world where it doesn't matter to be still consuming high levels of meat and still to be taking airline flights? Because there's a cognitive dissonance that advertising introduces into our lives that makes it very hard to follow the recommendations that we're hearing from other areas. And that's a really, really important and under-scrutinized problem that we see with advertising. And alter our values. What values are we seeing? What cultural norms is advertising introducing around our role? Is it as an active citizen who's politically engaged? Is it as someone who has the power to interact with our city and participate in democratic processes? Or is it to be defined as a consumer? And that's the pressure that advertising introduces. And we know we're already overshooting planetary boundaries. As Monica was saying, we need to reduce our consumption-based emissions, and yet we're being told to consume. And this has a disproportionate impact on less wealthy areas of the world, whilst in wealthier areas and wealthier individuals in those areas are consuming more. Those impacts on the environment, on nature, on rapidly depleting nature, there's leading to ecological degradation and degraded human rights as well. So whilst advertising is a powerful cultural force and has been called the cultural water we swim in, we have to think what direction that's leading us in compared to the direction we need to be going in. And to put it very simply in a very basic graphic, overconsumption is advertising's business model. Whilst we need to reduce our consumption and associated emissions, advertising wants to take us to a place where those emissions and consumption is increasing. And I know this will come up in Leo's presentation from advertising later as well, but advertising in the UK, where we're based, is responsible for 208 million tonnes of CO2 in 2022. And that year, it meant that advertising had responsibility for increasing the emissions of every single person in the UK by 32%. So this isn't something tiny, it's something massive. And it's a logical step that if we address this, we can start to address some of the emissions that we desperately need to reduce. And here's one example again that I know will come up later when we hear from Harlem. We know we need to reduce meat and dairy consumption. It's really crucial for climate goals. And we know quite clearly that the emissions from beef, red meat, ruminant meats and dairy are disproportionately large, and that moving to plant-based diets is going to massively reduce our emissions. We've heard this repeatedly from all ears. And it's been estimated in the EU, for example, that meat consumption needs to drop by 70%. But how are we going to do that when we're surrounded every single day by adverts like these, promoting, normalizing, and encouraging a climate-damaging diet? In a second example, lots of cities are working on reducing emissions from road transport, moving away from private cars towards systems around public transport and active travel. And here's one example of a contradiction that we quite often see: a tweet from Bristol City Council talking about active travel schemes in the city, which the council is putting money towards and encouraging. And simultaneously in the same month, an advert for an SUV car, a diesel-powered SUV car on our bus network. So again, a real contradiction there. And yet, talking from Adfree Cities' perspective, we also think a lot about billboards, in particular digital billboards, which are increasing in size and number across the UK, not just in towns and cities, but rural areas as well. One of these large digital screens requires the same electricity as 11 UK homes, and a smaller screen that you might see on a bus stop uses the same electricity as 4 UK homes. And with more and more of these screens, the actual impact of the screens themselves, not only on people who have to live opposite them or drive past and are distracted, not only the number of adverts that we see on there, but also just the billboards themselves are using a lot of electricity at a time when electricity is scarce. So in summary, high carbon advertising is incompatible with efforts to protect public health and also to reach net zero goals. But there are lots of things that city leaders and residents can do, and I'll just quickly, I know I'm coming up to time, so I'll quickly skim through some of the things that we do here at Adfree Cities and examples from across the world. So the first thing, a big thing city governments can do is to reduce or remove advertising in public space. And there's some really high profile examples. In 2006 in Sao Paulo, billboards were defined by law as visual pollution and removed across the city in a step which is credited with big impacts on people's health, well-being, their mental health, and as well as being a powerful force to reduce the amount we're consuming through commercial messaging. In Grenoble in France in 2015, some 300 billboards were removed and trees were planted instead, which is definitely a happier city to be in. And I'll talk through a bit of resident-led action in Bristol and the UK, which is where we are now. So Adfree Cities' volunteer group Adblock Bristol, which is a resident-led group, work along with Bristol City Council to prevent new digital billboards coming to the city, to reduce the amount of commercial advertising we're exposed to here. And over the last 5 years, we've blocked 40 new large digital billboards, the really massive ones and several more smaller ones. And that's something that councils can implement, city leaders can implement into their local planning policy, as well as supporting resident-led campaigns like this. A second step city governments can take, which I know Leo will talk about, is to introduce a low carbon advertising policy. And several councils in the UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, and more have introduced restrictions on high carbon advertising. So that's adverts for particularly polluting products like cars, airlines, fossil fuels, red meat. And recently we commissioned a piece of legal advice, which is relevant to the UK, but other places too, to show that this step is lawful, proportionate, and necessary to tackle consumption-based emissions. And we have resources on this on our website, and I know that Advertising do too. And yeah, I'll let Leo talk about that more in his presentation. And a third step city governments can take is to lobby national government. City leaders obviously have certain leverage within national governments to say that this is a step that could be taken on a national basis to have a ban on adverts that are particularly polluting, and also to have better planning policies to mean that it's easier to for councils to refuse new digital screens and easier for residents to be involved in those democratic processes. We also celebrate alternatives to advertising at Adfree Cities, community, art and nature, and we advocate that public space that is for people is much better for our well-being, mental well-being, our physical well-being. And there's a picture of tree planting here and a scheme we ran where we had a community painting event instead of commercial advertising. These kind of alternatives are a really powerful way to reimagine the way that we see our cities if they were free from advertising, which we would say is a healthier place to be. So please do contact us for resources and more information. There's our website, our kind of social media handle, and you can find us at hello@adfreecities.org.uk. I'm sure I've probably overrun, so I'll stop sharing and pass back to Monica.